Good evening, Dr. Wood. This is John Matola. I'm going to be doing my video assignment for the midterm, and I appreciate this opportunity you give us as a class and each member to get a little bit more experience behind a camera or in front of a camera. And I'll be addressing five questions, and I'm going to read each question and then give you my personal thoughts based on what I've learned in terms of my ability to answer the questions and give you hopefully a couple things to think about that weren't necessarily mentioned in the text or in any of the videos or articles related to it. Um, I will do my best to keep it at 5 minutes, no more than 5 minutes for each question. And here we go. So, with the first question we're going to look at is have how have recent historical events affected the course of research in organizational psychology? Give an example of an event and the resulting outcome. Uh, I think two things come to mind in terms of you know events, and one is 9/11, and that's what's discussed in the text and all the things that came out of that. And I would argue just as much as 9/11 is what the pandemic has done in terms of changing and modifying organizations in terms of how they're organized structurally and what their expectations are at every level, from the individual employee to small units to large groups. Going back to the first one, I think that 9/11 changed a lot. It changed a lot. What I'm going to focus on is what changed on the battlefield. And The history of the United States Army, especially, they have a history of having a support structure or a command to support uh, units at war or combat units. This goes all the way back to the War of 1812, the Civil War, World War One, World War Two, Korea, and Vietnam. But there's some interesting things that came out of changes that the 21st century brought, and it what you saw not just people bringing beans and bullets or supplies, from the civilian side and managing them in terms of on the battlefield, but you saw basically private organizations, non-military entities such as Blackwater, conducting security operations, which arguably is a combat operation. According to the principles of war, security is one of those principles. So, what happened was the Army and the DoD, Department of Defense, got very frustrated with this to the point that they developed a contract command because they had no way of keeping track and synchronizing all events coming from the civilian side or the contractor sides into the overall, con plan or operation plan, campaign plan at any level, tactical, operationally, and strategically. So I'd say that that's one of the major things that was Army established that in January 30th of 2008, and it sits today as one of the key reminders of how not only the battle space, the battlefield has changed. A unique perspective of that is that it pertains to people under the DoD umbrella, but it doesn't account for other agencies such as the State Department, some of the intelligence agencies, some of the law enforcement agencies, and all these have roles on the battlefield. And I can speak personally for Afghanistan, so that is quite new. And then going back to the pandemic, I mean, if you look at what has happened with the pandemic, it is apropos now to work from home. And I think organizations, corporate, nonprofit, and private have to make those adjustments. And it's a challenge because what they have to look at is how do we synchronize somebody who's not here, yet he or she is going to provide a significant portion to our success. I think that gives a pretty fair rendering of how and why history has changed organizational structures at this point. Um, Question number two: describe the socialization project for graduate students in your program. Is the program successful in socializing newcomers? Two things. One, I think this is a binary approach. One is at the macro level, and the other is on the micro level, specific to school. Okay, I believe that the what the Liberty does specifically, I think they use something very similar to what Jones in 1986 did as a takeoff from Van Mayen in Shen in 1979. And what that is it looks at things in three different perspectives. And this is where I make an argument that I think the school does that too. Is it looks at it contextually, it looks at it socially, and it looks at it in terms of content. The first two, I believe that the school, the greater school, the university system at Liberty addresses the first two, contextually and socially. If you look at the way you are brought into the organization as a new student, me personally, I've been only a graduate student, so I can speak at that level. But they apply what I think is the six steps that Chow and associates use, and that is history, language, and politics, people, organization, goals, values, and performance proficiency. Now, the latter of those two, I believe, are at the micro level, and I would argue also that it stays away from politics. But in terms of history, language, and people, I think the university uses that as acculturation for all students. Now, when we get down to the students at the tactical level, my military comes at me all the time, or in the classroom, that's what I think is a micro focus of the socialization, and that falls hand in hand with Jones's model and in those three perspectives. So I think they do a really good job of that. And the teacher, I would include you as one of those that are very successful at it, is getting students to integrate, become familiar with each other, and communicate. It may seem like it's a requirement, but me personally, I see it as an opportunity, and I'm sure there's a lot of other students that see that as well. So, and that leads to the next part of this, the embeddedness. Okay, for me, the embeddedness, I personally believe I've experienced that really up close and personal, and I wrote about it in one of our discussions in terms of uh, joining the army as an enlisted guy, going through the process, a lot of things that are common to all, and then you become a conventional or infantry officer, and everything is pretty structured in terms of from the mission set to your professional development. Then, when you volunteer for Special Forces, which is a branch within the Army, you see where there's a high degree of fit, and that's what Mitchell describes it as. Is basically embedded as a high degree of fit, you know, in terms of the people, the work, and the task. And I experienced that firsthand, so I really am familiar, and I believe in the embeddedness and what it can do for what we would call esprit de corps, motivation. Esprit de corps goes beyond motivation in the sense that it brings a common bond, unlike any others, and there's no reason why it couldn't exist in the corporate, nonprofit or the private enterprise. I think just people are not had much experience with it, and they're unaware of the benefits of it. So I think that if you look at, going back to the question, it's describe the socialization process for grad students in the program, and then is the program successful for newcomers in creating embeddedness? I would say yes, because I think that if you look at it specific to IO, and full disclosure, I was a developmental guy, and it just didn't seem like it was in my wheelhouse, and I switched over, and I'm glad I did, because with industrial IO psychology, in my opinion, you can create a level of esprit de corps, if you will, because organizations and are common point of reference for just about any human being on this planet. Question number three. Question number three. How can an organization reduce or prevent work-family conflict? Okay, that's the key, right? Work-family contract, or family work conflict. One of the two. Now, I proposed in our last, I believe it was the last discussion, that part of and I use the Army as an example. I'm not trying to beat up on the Army, but I think it's probably more common amongst a lot of organizations out there, is that the trajectory of the problem is addressed way too late. And work family contact, it needs to be addressed, whether it's WFC or FWC, it needs to be addressed earlier. And the argument that I made in that paper is that if you wait too late, then it stabilizes. It stabilizes in the form of maladaptive behavior, maladaptive events. And what does that mean? That means crime, drugs, alcohol, violence. And that's why I think it has to come earlier. Now, what is it that has to come earlier? That I think if you look at the way um, uh, psychopathologists address maladaptive behavior, and one could argue that a work family conflict could be maladaptive behavior on somebody's part, whether it's the organization or the family. But there's a delta there. There's a difference, and I think that needs to be addressed. And I think one of the ways you do it, as I argued in that discussion, is you're proactive about it. You address it's a learning process. Everything related to the work family conflict, or the work non-work interface, which is a grander term, is basically comes down to uh, uh, cognitive processes. And if we can get ahead in these cognitive process, and use resources prior to those resources getting depleted, then you're ahead of it. And there's some things that work that way, but I don't think it's as much family work conflict related. You hear about resiliency programs; those are great, but I think that is more to do with isolated parts or components of the greater work family work conflict. What's an example of that? You're looking at stressors, uh, dislocation, or being apart for periods of time. That I think that if you look at it from a different perspective, that I think that cognitive behavior therapy, which is the analogy I'm alluding to, specifically trauma focused uh, cognitive behavior therapy, which psychopathologists use. It changes the input or the inference of what is happening, and you look at it that I have to change the way I infer. They have to change. It's flawed, and I need to use more appropriate cognitive process to solve that problem. So I think if you look at it, that is probably in my opinion, haven't seen much where you see a psychopathology perspective get transposed on top of an IO kind of issue. But I would venture to say that somebody would find that interesting. I could be wrong, but one of the thing that specifically the problem is, it's an appraisal process. Okay, an appraisal process of what I have to use, and when you get to a point you're like, I don't have enough to solve this problem. That's when the fear, or according to the challenge hindrance theory, comes in, and that is that this is now going to be a hindrance instead of viewed as, me with sufficient resources, I can use it as a challenge where positive outcomes come out of that. So, and what would that be? That would be mastery, goals, and personal gains or professional gains. So, I think looking at that gives a pretty good rendition of what my personal belief is with work family conflict and the way to be solved. Going to question four. Imagine if you've been asked to develop a performance assessment program for employee development. What techniques could you use to adequately evaluate employee performance as comprehensively as possible? Think of Murphy's List. Well, me personally, I think I think the one that I liked better was Campbell. I think Campbell's 8 points are more specific. It applies less room for error, and not to take anything away from Murphy's, but part of the reason I'm familiar with that is that that's exactly what the United States Army uses to evaluate its officers and non-commissioned officers. I would use that very similar. It lists, enroll and extra roll components or functional areas, and I think that would be a good way to develop it. I want to add 4 things to that, though. This is what I would change about Campbell's model, and make it identify 4 things I think are wrong, and then come up with solutions to it. Number one, if you look at almost every single evaluation, regardless of where it is, my personal experience, and I'm sure that there's some substantive thought about this, in other circles, is it always appears that it's a one-way street. That, what do I mean by that? It's that it's the employer or the organization directing, guiding, and informing the person or the employee with, I get the responsibility part. I get all that goes with it. But let me give you an example. I think it could be different, and I think it could be different in the sense of, instead of having only a one-way street, have a 360-degree viewpoint, or 360 degrees point of entry instead of one way. And the military, all branches use this. It's called a 360-degree assessment, and they kind of play with words a little bit. Assessment, they say it's not an evaluation, and I would argue that it's not part of the evaluation, because it's designed as an assessment more so for senior officers. Is that I think that you would see a significant change if that changed to an evaluation where somebody in a subordinate role was able to evaluate. And why would you allow that? I'll tell you why. 2 reasons. Okay, if you look at Campbell's model, there's 2 things. I believe it's number 7 and number 8. Right? 7 is supervision and leadership, and number 8 is management and administration. Do you think that if a subordinate employee or member had an opportunity to share, which I think that they're the receiver or the recipient of leadership, they have just as good as an optic, if not better at times in certain areas, than a supervisor or a senior leader or somebody in the command structure. Number 2, management and administration. Management, who gets managed? Okay, who gets administered to? Yeah, everything's great when it all goes well, right? But what about those times when it doesn't? There's if the supervisor, the mid level, officer was in there, and even a senior officer, and they realized, and they had the responsibility that the people that they serve had a voice in their leadership evaluation, or their management evaluation, or their administration. I think you would see over time a better or more well-rounded leader, officer, corporate manager, whatever you want to say. So I think that those are really, really key. And I think that if you go down a little bit in the road with that, you would see that those things will make an important impression. Just 2 last things with that. One is that you know one of the things that in the Army, that when you get evaluated as an officer, the person evaluate you get evaluated at the level just above you. You get evaluated at 2 levels up. So if I'm a special forces detachment commander, an A-team commander, I'm going to get evaluated by my company commander, who's a major, which is the first level, and a field grade officer in the United States military. Then I'm going to get senior rated by the battalion commander, who is a lieutenant colonel. Here's the challenge, though, and you never hear that talked about this. In the military system of evaluation, the rater's profile, how he judges other people, is a operational constraint, because he can only have so many people in the middle. He can only have so many people on the top, and he can only have so many people on the bottom. What I would argue, you have a lot of people on the bottom. The point is, you could be in a great team, done great as a leader, and the bottom line is that there's one or two more that are just did the same as you did, and that raider and that senior raider cannot afford to have an extra person at that level, say graded number one. Then it's disingenuous, and you never hear that talk about in this entire section, chapters 1 through 6. You don't see the flip side of this, and I think that that's something where IO needs to go. I would do it. I would do it in a heartbeat. I think you could. I'd go straight to DoD, and there's a plethora of issues that can be fixed by reorganization structurally, uh, uh, in in many ways. The last question is going to be, what are some possible common organizational constraints, and how could they lead to counterproductive behaviors? First, I believe it's Peter and O'Connor, 1980. They saw basically uh, organizational constraints as something that inhibits the translation of motivation and abilities to effective performance. That makes sense to me. What specifically, you're looking at work stress, uh, not enough information to do a job, not the right equipment to do a job, not the right personnel to do a job, do more with less. All those things, add up to an organizational constraint, and it's literally could be innumerable number of type of things that are considered organizational constraints. Um, there's three studies that I personally found that shows, and this is important, as we as psychologists, or want to be psychologists, learning to be psychologists, a significant positive relationship. Okay, that says a lot. It's not a correlation, it's a significant positive relationship between organizational constraints and CWB, which is counterproductive work behavior. Okay, first, Ansari et al. 2013, Chand and Chan 2014, and then Matthew et al. 2014, all found a significant positive relationship between organizational constraints and counterproductive work behavior. So I think that gives a pretty good uh, uh, understanding of how you get to counterproductive work behavior. One of the things that you also see is that each one of these, if it's withdrawal, if it's sabotage, all those lead to counterproductive work behavior. But the constraints are probably more more ambiguous, and probably more difficult to define and discern, whether it's through an experiment or a meta-analysis. So I would say that those three studies alone will give evidence and credence to, there is a relation, a significant positive one, between organizational constraints and counterproductive work behavior. And how does it lead to it? Because it's negative in nature. I mean, it's absolutely negative. You're setting the employee up for failure. Okay, how does that happen? By giving him not the required resources, not time, equipment, uh, um, personnel. Okay, that creates a level of stress that it creates unnecessary and undue challenge for uh, for the employee. And what's the recourse for the employee? Sure, he can or she can go through certain areas, and voice, their opinion or their thoughts for redress. But at the end of the day, if that's the responsibility of the organization to don't ask somebody to do something if you're not going to resource them. So and it becomes one of the alternatives for solving their immediate problem. So that's my take on the 25 or excuse me the 5 questions. I went over about a minute total. Thank you very much, Dr. Wood, for your time, for your instruction in the class. I appreciate it. I'm learning a whole lot, and I'm very happy I switched from being a developmental psychology guy to an industrial organizational psychology major or graduate student. Thank you for your time.